Another way to do therapy. Not all therapy is about annihilating pain or annihilating emotions. Who really wants to read about therapy? Hopefully you, because the way we do therapy has a lot to do with the way we do life. Good therapy is a microcosm of life, a series of dioramas of our real existence. Since basically forever, there have been movements to take the human out of the therapy process. Even Sigmund Freud, while enthusiastic and even vibrant about the possibilities of life, preferred that his companions be disciples who slavishly followed in his ruts, unable to have ideas of their own. This is a ridiculously complex period of time to gloss over with a couple of sentences and really makes dripping reading. Things grew worse from there with behaviorist protocols and manualized therapy really getting started in the 1980s. Literally, some professionals expected that the therapist become a machine that listened to a complaint and read an intervention from a manual, much like you might use to program the timer on your coffee maker. Never mind that the human being is dizzyingly complex and unpredictable at the individual level. But therapy is a human endeavor, and the best therapies make use of the human connection. What better way to learn about your feelings than sharing them with sympathetic others? What better way to figure out one's relationships than through a relationship? One of the first people to come see me as a therapist in training was very reluctant to speak of anything personal. Her initial complaint was so forgettable that I've forgotten it. I thought I would fail my comprehensive exams because she was the only case I had that I could write about, and she was so dull, so lifeless, that it was very difficult to illustrate any major principles using her case. Even having written quite extensively about her for these exams, I recall little or any of our first meetings. This client wanted to make a particular use of therapy. She wanted to complain about all the people in her life, particularly her boyfriend. She was quite all right with the idea of me making suggestions or giving some advice. This afforded her the chance to argue, or worse, to try out some of that advice and then report how much worse things had become. I tried gamely to get her to talk about herself rather than the people lying to her, cheating on her, stealing from her. It took a long time to make even sporadic progress. The breakthrough came when she started talking about missing her home out in the backwoods of a southern state. Now she was able to speak with some feeling. Here was something that mattered to her. Suddenly I could do all the things my teachers were saying a therapist should do. I could notice her posture out loud, say something about how her voice changed, comment on how much less defensive she seemed when talking about her home. She had had a house and left it for love, for the internet version of it anyway, chasing the dream of love. And she had left real love behind her. For the sake of romance that turned out to be fleeting, she gave up the love of place, home, the warm arms of the land that she had inhabited all her life. There had been a river, a well, pastures, woods, all of it on her own property. A little clapboard house with no conveniences, but familiarity and a long history. She drew it for me, painted it, wrote poetry about it, dreamed of it. At last, here was something. It was not much of a breakthrough. Mostly she wanted to vent in session and was happy to pay $10 an hour for the privilege. My trainers and the clinic bosses were not happy with this. Low income places like ours had very limited resources to spare, and they viewed her as a waste of my and their time. But it was a breakthrough. Eventually, she told me about a dream, wrote a poem about it. In the dream, she was some fantasy figure, an idealized woman with the wind in her hair and a falcon on her arm, a sword on her hip. And then she was gone. She moved back home, letting go of the illusion of romance and moving south again. She could never have her old house back, but she could be close to family, live at least near her old places with more appreciation of what they all meant. This poem, the thing about being someone of importance with power and presence, this was nearly the last thing she expressed to me and came just before leaving for home. She had never before known how to say anything about how she felt. It took a long time to express any feeling at all, but when she did, she found a receptive place for that expression. It is possible, and I like to believe, that when I sat with her feelings about home, she was able to tolerate some of the pain of losing home long enough to know that pain reflected her love of home. And as home loved her back so well, as I loved her so well as to be able to sit with her feelings, she had this vision of herself as someone worthy of love. It took courage for her to go home. It took courage to admit that her man did not love her as she deserved to be loved, that she'd made a mistake in coming here. It took courage to value herself enough to cut her losses and go, to say goodbye to her boyfriend here. He argued and said, "Don't, I'll do better." And she knew these were lies. After that, therapy became easier, a more natural process. I learned not to direct people to tell me their feelings, but to listen for them, help people know about them more seriously. Therapy became much more about being a real person with other people. I started to appreciate the more the courage it took for people to share with me what they came to share, to really love them for their expression of pain, courage and beauty, luminosity. Eventually, my therapy career would not really survive graduate school. I could not afford to work for free, and I could not afford to take a job that would compromise my values, values of pain. This is a way to do therapy. Be with the feelings rather than chase them off. Create a safe space for those feelings to rear up and snarl or sing or exclaim. Sometimes that is pretty easy. People come with their feelings on their sleeves, ready to talk about them. All we have to do is not shut down the expression, not direct it into some curing trajectory and back into the dark. Sometimes it's very difficult. The person does not know their feelings or is uncommonly guarded about them. There is nothing to vivify, to help listen to. These can be the hardest clients to sit with and listen to, the most tempting to dismiss or blame for their failures in therapy. I lost one such patient to the early part of my training process. My supervisor demanded that I move him along, fire him from therapy to make room for a more productive client. When a therapy client expresses a feeling, we're naturally confronted with this dilemma to help the person get over the feeling in some manner, or to help the person sit with and understand the feeling. There's a strong temptation to reframe the feeling or help the client feel something else. This is especially strong with dangerous emotions or urges. Imagine your client says, for example, "I wish I was dead." Perhaps the first words on your lips are, "Of course you don't wish that." You might instead wonder with the person about all the things they have to live for. What is keeping them from their suicide, or even what bad feelings lead to this urge? It is possible, though, in the context of a strong relationship, to sit with the feeling and the urge, to inquire more about it. How does it feel to say this now? Might be a prompt, if one is needed. When you think about taking your life, how do you feel? Once expressed and acknowledged, much like when one says, "I feel angry right now." the pressure of it can often recede. It can become tolerable where formerly it was extremely painful. The feeling of suicide ideation might not need to be cured. Here we need to be extremely careful, and for obvious reasons, but even the urge to self harm might actually be a helpful urge. Recall an earlier discussion of the things we do in order to perceive control over our environments or ourselves. Sometimes things seem so far out of our control that thoughts of suicide help us tolerate the emotions that swirl about us in the chaos of our out of control lives. Maybe you're driving to work and you know that any number of bad things could happen, from being fired capriciously to being assaulted. You think to yourself that this life is intolerable and that you could always kill yourself. And the chaos seems to recede for a moment because now you are living your life voluntarily by your own volition and consent. You've chosen to live. That can be the thing that makes all the difference. For some people, making friends with their thoughts of suicide is the best thing to happen to them. To recognize these feelings as part of us, an important and helpful part, can be the thing that saves our lives. It might be that we lose something by taking the person to the hospital and drowning their sadness in medicine. I've met many people, personally and professionally, who experience various levels of post traumatic stress. I prefer to leave the disorder part off of descriptions of people, as the existence of mental illness is highly contestable. Curing them of their fear and anxiety is often impractical. One client in particular responded to relaxation techniques by becoming even more anxious. The anxiety was a shield against the unexpected, and without the anxiety, she felt exposed, naked, vulnerable. The anxiety that accompanies post traumatic stress, as well as the various other things we call symptoms, are in truth natural and advantageous adaptations to the environment. Curing them might be a mistake. A combat veteran might come about their symptoms honestly. The stress reaction narrows their focus, keeps them wary of danger, easy to awaken, touchy. They're quick to anger and quick to violence, and these are the things that help us survive the very situations that provoked these symptoms. And if we're going to send someone back into those situations, it needs to be with such reactions intact. Clients of mine have expressed intense gratitude when I begin the relationship with this understanding. The problem is not the symptoms of post traumatic stress, but the context in which they occur. Home and work life, far from danger in a seemingly civilized society. In the context that birthed them, they are life, security, control. Sometimes the best thing to do is just be with people while they feel what they feel. Understand how these feelings are helpful and maintain the safety of the environment. When sadness becomes an ally, the person might continue to feel sad, but in such a context that the sadness no longer bothers them. When two siblings fight, it might be the parent's instinct to separate the siblings, but we would never consider killing one of them to have peace. And really, the best course of action is to teach them to be allies with one another. So it is, again, with the emotions people have. The emotion is the person as much as the person suffering over the emotion is the person. Why kill one for the sake of the other? Which do you choose? Secondary emotions. This brings us to the problem of emotions about emotions, or secondary emotions. The emotions we have are often not what is really bothering us so much as the emotions we have about our emotions. Our anger or the way we act it out makes us afraid or ashamed. Then we fight the anger For fear, it will find expression, cause us to be alienated, and so on. Perhaps we're sad, but afraid of the sadness, afraid of the pain sadness might cause. We can think of this like a trip to the dentist. It is never, ever as bad as we think it will be. We've built up so much in our minds about how bad the dentist is that in fact nothing can compare to our imagination. We fret and panic about an upcoming appointment, lose sleep over it, complain to everyone who will even appear to listen, but when we get there, it is not so bad as we had imagined and even helps us. Either our teeth are cleaner and feel good, or else some dental pain has been taken out. We retreat from our emotions in this way, imagining sadness to be much more painful than it really is. Sadness can even be helpful, worthwhile, beautiful, but we run from it in fear or turn it into anger. Anger, at least we can control or use to control the environment. Anger, at least, protects us from fear, and grim determination protects us from happiness. Yeah, even happiness can be denied. We know that happiness is temporary, have lived lives where every moment of happiness has turned to disappointment and grief, where love has soured and left us vulnerable. Happiness causes us to be very wary. It leads inevitably to disappointment, safer to despair. Much of therapy can be about feeling the primary emotions and learning that they are helpful, learning that they do not hurt as much as we think they will, and making the secondary emotions no longer needed. Once the feelings about feelings have dissipated, we can become a more refined, purer, more authentic version of ourselves. Does every feeling have value? People like to reduce every argument to its most absurd form. The idea that emotions have value if we discuss it in public quickly tends to devolve into its most extreme forms. The easy emotions obviously have value. What is life worth without laughter and love and satisfaction and even pride? People will accept that a little jealousy might be good for the love life, or even the little sadness might make things poignant. But what about despair? Should we just sit with that, or shouldn't we try to cure it? Despair, after all, is dangerous. People tend to view despair as the opposite of hope, and we are very attached to hope. People do not want to live in a hopeless world. Indeed, we can see suicide thoughts as indicative of hopelessness. A situation that is unbearable and inescapable leads us to this last layer of control over continued existence. But there are no such things as opposites. Opposites do not really exist in the real material world in which we conduct our business. They're just ideas we have. The non existence of opposites is illustrated by the great many paradoxes we encounter. A paradox is often an indication that two things we think are opposites are not really. Take a coin, for example. Does it really have two sides? Why not count the edge as a side? Why is it not all one object, the front and the back really one thing and not two things joined together? There are at least two ways to hope: naively and insightfully. Naive hope, thoughtless hope, is the kind of hope that leads people to giant prayer meetings in football stadiums in response to drought and climate change. We hope that things will change, but are unwilling to do anything to make the change. If you hope to win the lottery, but you've not even bought a ticket, you hope naively. Deep or insightful hope, however, is not opposite of despair, but requires it. Despair is the knowledge that things are bad and probably unsolvable. Certain facts should cause us dismay, If we're honest and face up to what we really feel, a terminal diagnosis should almost certainly cause significant pain. Reading climate change figures should dismiss any simple, naive hope. Knowing how bad racism remains in the United States should be very disturbing. And when we see how entangled the whole problem is, how above the scale of any individual action, naive hope ought to be impossible. Despair, though, is not depression. Despair does not mean giving up. Without it, we cannot have real hope. Hope in this context means assessing the situation realistically, seeing how unlikely a real solution is, and then deciding not to give up on it. Doing the right thing even if it seems futile. Sometimes the right thing is right precisely because it is futile. That is hope. All of this is not to say that despair is necessarily commendable, admirable, or advisable. Despair is not for everybody. It can be dangerous. Despairing people can act out in hurtful, unacceptable, or even destructive ways, including suicide or self destructive behavior like alcoholism. On the other hand, despair might not give way to annihilation style psychological treatments and might not even remit to positive thinking or religious approaches.